Well, thank you. Thank you. It always feels good to get claps at the front end of a program. And of course, tonight we have a terrific subject and fabulous panelists. I want to welcome everybody to the National Constitution Center. I am Mike Gerhardt. I'm scholar in residence here at the National Constitution Center and also have the privilege of being a constitutional law professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I want to welcome everybody here tonight to our program. As you all know, before we begin the program, just have a few housekeeping details I want to go over. Later this month, we will host our final town hall program of the winter 2017 season, featuring constitutional scholar Jeffrey Stone, his new book on sex and the Constitution, and I have the honor of moderating that program. Jeff Stone is my former constitutional law professor, mentor, and friend, so that'll be a lot of fun. Members will receive free admission to that program as well as our daytime programs. And if you're not already a member, please visit Rebecca Bolden outside the auditorium after the program to sign up today. And lastly, of course, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. And now, without any further ado, I want to introduce our terrific panelists tonight in our discussion about the future of the Affordable Care Act. To my immediate left is Josh Blackman. He's an associate professor of law at South Texas College of Law who specializes in constitutional law and the Supreme Court and written two major books on the subject of tonight's program, among other things. Next to him is Abbe Gluck. Abbe is a professor of law and the faculty director of the Solomon Center for Health Law and Policy at Yale Law School. She served as co-counsel on a Supreme Court brief in King versus Burwell, the 2015 challenge to the Affordable Care Act, as well as an earlier case challenging, of course, the ACA in 2012. Next to Abbe is Julie Rovner. Julie is the Robin Toner Distinguished Fellow and Chief Washington Correspondent for Kaiser Health News. She joined Kaiser after 16 years as Health Policy Correspondent for NPR, where she helped lead the network's coverage of the passage and implementation of the Affordable Care Act. I don't think we could have three better people to talk about an important subject. Please join me in welcoming them. Thank you. Our topic is so important, in fact, it's actually unfolding in real time. Congress is actually currently thinking about how to reform the Affordable Care Act. But before we talk about what's happening right here in the moment, I want to turn to Julie and first get a sense of kind of how we got from there to here, the path that's brought us to the present.
Well, I think a lot of people like to start the health debate as far back as Teddy Roosevelt, but I would say that what we're talking about currently started actually right here in Pennsylvania in 1991 in a special election for the Senate where an unknown named Harris Wofford beat the sitting Attorney General of the United States, and part of what he said in his campaign is that healthcare should be a right, and that basically created healthcare as a national issue. So when Bill Clinton got elected, he set out to do healthcare reform. And as we all know, that didn't work so well. But one of the things I think that the Democrats discovered is that if you try to change the healthcare system, which even then was a pretty big chunk of the economy, and disrupt everybody's healthcare, it won't work. That was the main lesson that was learned from the Clinton failure. One of the other important things that happened during that, though, is that while the Clinton plan was pushing the idea of requiring employers to provide insurance, Republicans came up with an alternative. And their alternative, which actually also it did not come out of the Heritage Foundation, it came out of a professor here at the University of Pennsylvania, was for the individual mandate, was to have people have personal responsibility for having their own health care, or else they would have to pay a fine. That was the Republican alternative to the Clinton plan. So fast forward to 2006, and we all remember Mitt Romney in Massachusetts with Romney Care, where he finally, for the first time, implemented what the Republicans had been pushing, the individual mandate. And it has actually worked quite well in Massachusetts. I believe they have the lowest rate of uninsured in the country, or they certainly did for several years. There's not been a whole lot of pushback. So when President Obama got elected in 2008, healthcare wasn't actually really even his big issue. It was an issue that had been percolating among many of the other Democrats who ran for president. He came to it somewhat reluctantly, but he luckily for him came to it at a time when almost all the big stakeholders in healthcare were fed up. So you had the insurance industry, you had big business, you had hospitals, you had doctors who were all ready for a change. And basically what they had coalesced around was the idea of having this individual mandate, the way Massachusetts had done. And when the Obama administration got in, they said two things. First of all, we don't want to make the mistake that Clinton did. That was the origin of the now ill-fated line that President Obama had, if you like your plan, you can keep your plan. That was basically code for, we're not going to mess with the majority of people who get their insurance on the job. We're only going to try to fix this dysfunctional individual market. That was the goal of that. So they wanted to do that. And then the second thing was they wanted to work with Republicans. They said, here's a Republican idea. We're going to take that. And they spent a lot of time in the summer of 2009, as some of you may remember, trying to entice some Republicans around to what they were trying to do. Republicans not only didn't want to participate, we had the big, blow up in the summer of 2009 with the town hall meetings and the death panels and all the efforts of the Republicans to prevent the bill from passing. Well, the bill, as we all know, did pass, but because it passed with only Democratic votes, there was this continuing concern and the continuing rallying cry about Republicans originally to repeal it and then later to repeal and replace it. But really, until about a half an hour ago, we had never seen a real replacement bill in legislative language from the Republicans. Now, I would say going forward, there's a couple of big obstacles to this replacement becoming law. One, a huge difference between now and 2009. In 2009, Democrats had 60 votes in the Senate, so they could defeat a filibuster. Republicans now have 52 votes in the Senate. Another problem, you've got a huge conservative faction in the House that doesn't like keeping almost any of the bill, and you've got a significant, not huge, but remember they only have 52 votes in the Senate, a moderate faction in the Senate that won't vote for anything that the conservatives in the House will vote for. So that is a big issue. Another issue is that in order to avoid that filibuster in the Senate and pass a bill with 51 votes, there are a lot of things that they can't do in this budget reconciliation bill, and that would be repeal the entire law. So they can only repeal pieces of it, and we're about to embark on an extraordinarily messy debate that's going to be hard to follow. Sorry.
I think we just set a world record in terms of how fast we moved through that.
I've done this before.
You're going to do it again in a second. But Abbe, give us your perspective on what tonight's topic, Future of Affordable Care Act, and particularly, of course, from your own experience and expertise as a lawyer and law professor.
Sure. Well, thanks. Thanks for having me. I was trying to think about what things we want to sort of take away from a discussion about the Affordable Care Act in today's context. And sort of three things came to my mind that I sort of wanted to frame our discussion. I think the Affordable Care Act is a fundamentally misunderstood law. I'm going to talk about that in a second. I also think that we're going to see a replacement that is not going to look that different from it. And it's interesting to talk about why, think about why. Because it's so reviled, why is the replacement not going to look that different? And the third thing is that there's a lot of talk now about the Affordable Care Act imploding on itself, falling apart under its own weight. And I think we really need to hold Congress accountable because the Affordable Care Act is not falling apart because of itself. It's falling apart because it was strangled by the Republicans in Congress and sort of the biggest legal and political sabotage in American history. All right, so I'm going to quickly talk about those three things. One quick thing, I always do this when I do a talk, quick show of hands. Who in this room thinks a poor single man making $10,000 a year gets a health care handout from the federal government? Poor single man, $10,000 a year, that's your total income. Who thinks they get Medicaid from that? A lot of people, maybe, maybe not. Who thinks a rich person working for Pfizer gets some health care handout from the federal government? Okay, you guys are a very informed audience, okay? So the answer is that it's not actually the case that a poor single man is entitled to a health care handout under Medicaid, and that there's a substantial tax break that allows the 50% of us who get our health care from work to get that funded by the federal government. Most groups I talk to, even very educated people, don't really understand that basic premise. And a big part of the problem with our healthcare debate is that nobody really understands American healthcare. And Obama did a terrible, terrible job of communicating what the healthcare system is and what the Affordable Care Act was going to do. And I think that was the worst thing that their administration did. But as Julie says, I'm not going to repeat this, the ACA was modeled on a Republican idea. It didn't change the system. It expanded on what we already had, but it kept the components of our current system in place. It aimed to expand Medicaid. The Supreme Court screwed that up. It closed up a few holes in Medicare, and it made it easier for us, those of us who don't get our health care from our employer, to buy insurance on the individual market. But it wasn't a federal takeover of the healthcare system. It built on our existing hodgepodge of programs. It was important. 20 million people got insured through the Affordable Care Act, but it was incremental in terms of our structure. So that's why the Republican plans don't look that different from what the Affordable Care Act did, because A, it was modeled on a Republican idea, and they're going to have the same basic components, I think. There's going to be some money to the states for their low-income population under Medicaid. There's going to be tax benefits to individuals to help regular people get insurance. And there are going to be regulations on the insurance industry to force the industry to take most people at roughly the same rates and not discriminate against you if you're sick. That's pretty much very similar to what the Affordable Care Act did. So what are we fighting over? That's what I want to get at. We're not fighting over constitutional law. We're at the National Constitution Center, but we're not fighting over the Constitution when it comes to health care, and we're not even fighting over a basic philosophy of American health care, right? The big question when you think about health care is what health policy people like to call the tension between social solidarity and personal responsibility. So put differently, two people have the same disease, both need an operation. Should one get that operation because he can pay, and one should die because he cannot? That is the policy question in American healthcare. Do we hear anybody in Congress talking about that policy question? No. And that's not Trump, that's Obama, that's Clinton, that's everybody, okay? We never get to this deep question about what our healthcare system's supposed to do. And since we're here at the Constitution Center, let's be clear, there's no right to healthcare in our Constitution, right? But there's no right to not just healthcare, there's no right to education, there's no right to housing in our Constitution, because our Constitution, unlike some European counterparts, is a Constitution of negative rights, not positive rights. It tells people what the government can't do, but not what it might do or should do. Right? And what the Affordable Care Act accomplished in a very important way is it sort of shifted the needle on what we think the government should do when it comes to health care. 8 years ago, we didn't really think that more poor people should get health insurance, not as a national consensus, or 26-year-olds should be able to be on their parents' rolls, or that I should be able to get insurance even if I have cancer, right? Now that's a new baseline. Even Trump has adopted that new baseline. You're going to see the Republican plans starting from something around that baseline. That's a huge accomplishment for the Affordable Care Act. And then the last thing I just want to say is this point about the ACA imploding. I'll be very quick here because I don't want to take up too much time. But you're hearing over and over again the Affordable Care Act is collapsing under its own weight. It's a disaster, right? The strategy beginning in 2010 was based on a Republican strategy to, quote, exploit bits and pieces of the law. The law was called a bastard that has to be killed as a matter of political hygiene. There was a lawsuit filed the day the statute was passed. There was numerous other lawsuits filed. Most of the complaints you hear now about the insurance industry falling apart. The Affordable Care Act had provisions in the statute that were aimed to stabilize the insurance industry during the transition. The Republican Congress cut those provisions off by law, strangled the insurance industry, and caused this destabilization. Yes, Obama was not perfect. Yes, the law was not perfect, but a normal, responsible Congress would have fixed the law to make it better. So it's important to hold a democracy accountable for what's what. It's important to understand that the ACA suffered a lot because the Republicans did to it. And the last little point I'll make is that telling, the very first regulation passed by the offered by the Trump administration on healthcare is what? It's an insurance market stabilization regulation that aims to essentially put back those funds that Congress strangled out of the Affordable Care Act before, because now that they're in office, it's not such a good idea to destabilize the market. So it's just important to keep people accountable. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Well, Josh, the pressure is now increasing for you to get working a lot in a short amount of time.
Pressure? There's no pressure.
But I assume you would agree, of course, the ACA did extend coverage to 20 million people that hadn't had health care before. Is there anything else you would agree with in terms of the overall discussion?
It's a pleasure to be here with Abbe and Julie, both people I respect very deeply. And as Mike mentioned, I have a new book out called Unraveled, Obamacare, Religious Liberty, and executive power. I'll sign a copy for you later if you'd like. It's a good book.
He will be here to do that. I want to emphasize that.
I will. I'd like to tell a different story and a different narrative of history. And actually, Julie mentioned it during our discussion beforehand. Who here remembers the Harry and Louise commercials in the early 1990s? You remember this, right? A ma and pa sitting at the table. Go on YouTube, you can find these videos. And the setup was this. They were reading the Clinton healthcare plan, and they didn't like it. And they said, and I'm not paraphrasing, I like my health insurance. I like my doctor. I want to keep my doctor. Those commercials are why Hillary Care failed. If you look at the public opinion polling in the aftermath of the Harry and Louise ads, it plummeted. Why? Because people wanted to keep what they had. The Obama administration, really the Clinton administration, who came up with this plan, Neera Tanden among others, said, okay, we can't allow people to think they'll lose their plans. So we will create this narrative. If you like your plan, you can keep your plan. You've all heard it 100 times. And this wasn't just a lie, it was a pernicious one, because it created a sense of entitlement that you can help 20 million Americans gain insurance without harming what you already have. That you can extend coverage on Medicaid through subsidies in these marketplaces without impacting what already exists. And this was frankly impossible. This wasn't a bad sales job, it was a con job. People were frankly misled. And it was on this basis the ACA passed. But at the same time that this con job was going on, the Tea Party arose. Now, we don't think of the Tea Party much, we don't talk about them. But they arose in opposition to the ACA, not merely because they opposed it as a matter of pure partisan politics or that some moderate Republicans in Massachusetts supported it, right? The key point here was that they opposed a law that compelled you to buy health insurance. This was the cornerstone of the law, the individual mandate, that required virtually all Americans to buy health insurance. And this gave birth to indeed a constitutional challenge that was filed the day the law was signed, but was germinating well in advance of that. This wound its way to the Supreme Court, and as it breaks my heart every time I teach it, the Chief Justice said, well, Congress can't make you buy insurance, but they can tax you for going uninsured. What's the difference? Who the heck knows? But that is how the Chief Justice managed to uphold the law. That more or less put the ACA on a sound constitutional footing. At that point, the process pivoted to the political process. Mitt Romney, who had enacted Obamacare basically in his own state, Barack Obama called him the godfather of Obamacare. He was right. Mitt Romney tried to say, I want to win the election because I will repeal and replace Obamacare. That didn't go anywhere, and that simply failed. His election was a disaster. But the seeds against Obamacare were planted. And in every single election in which Republicans ran the platform of Obamacare repeal, they won more seats, and they won more seats, and they won more seats. So sometimes I feel there's a disconnect between people who think that this is such a popular law and that people love it versus the actual electoral results. Now, a funny thing has happened, though, in recent weeks. Since Barack Obama's been out of office, the popularity of the ACA has spiked. People now suddenly say, I love it because maybe I'm about to lose it. It's a damnedest thing. He couldn't sell the thing when he was in office, but now that he's out of office, and he's actually being quiet about it, for now at least, you're seeing this. So why are we where we are? The ACA was unique in that not a single Democrat voted in its support. I'm sorry, not a single Republican voted to support the law. Not one. And I think you can read this one of two ways. One, Republicans were being political partisan hacks, and they didn't want to do this because they hated Barack Obama, and they hated their Democrats and whatever else. Okay, you're here, right? Fair enough. I think there's a different way of reading it. The 2008 election was not about healthcare. Julie mentioned this. This was maybe the third or the fourth item on a list of priorities of why people voted in the 2008 election. This issue was mostly among healthcare wonks, and people cared about it, but this was not the driving force on the campaign trail. Barack Obama opposed the mandate on the campaign trail. He said it's like making a homeless person buy a house. Why would you do that? But because there's animosity one way or the other, not a single Republican enacted it. I think there was an arrogance, a hubris indeed, that you could pass this law on a party line vote and expect everyone to fall into line and love it. That simply didn't happen. Republicans defunded these various stabilization mechanisms. They filed lawsuit after lawsuit, many of which I filed briefs in support of. There was this massive sustained campaign to attack a law they had no part of. And I think what we're going to see now is a mirror image of this. In 2008 and 2009, we had the Tea Party opposing Obamacare. Now we have these Democrat groups storming town hall meetings. In 2009 and 10, you had Democrats passing a law on a party line vote. I think whatever Republicans pass will indeed be on a party line vote. This is not a recipe for success, my friends. No matter what happens, you need to have a package that appeals to both swaths. But in our polarized society, I think that's very difficult. And the act of passing Obamacare on this vote poisoned the well, I think, indefinitely. So I don't have much hope for whatever's passed, whatever this markup is this week. I think we'll be more or less stuck in the same place. It'll be called Obamacare, it'll be called Trump care, whatever it's going to be called. I think it's unlikely to yield the sort of results that health policy experts want. What it will allow me to do is write a third book on this, which I think will be called Undone. Thank you all so much for your attention. I welcome the discourse of my colleagues.
Wow.
How was that, Mike?
That's great.
Thank you.
You know, it's great. There's a trilogy. You know,
Return of the Jedi.
People love trilogies. Julie, so let me come back to you. We obviously covered a lot of ground. There are a lot of things I want to raise with you, but to some extent, I think I'll try and break it into a two-part question for you. Obviously, there's a lot of concern and controversy over what happens in this field. Is it political? Is it legal? You know, is it constitutional? Is it some combination of those? From your perspective, what might it be? And then the other part of my question is, what do you foresee happening next?
I think it's fundamentally political at this point. I mean, I thank you both for your very cogent sort of explanations of really the rest of how we got here. You know, the thing that's important to keep in mind, healthcare is now a fifth of the economy. Healthcare is now a fifth of the economy. I'm glad that President Trump discovered last week that healthcare is complicated. Those of us who have been working in this minefield for quite a long time were pretty much sure that that was the case. But I think, as we've heard, what happened, there was a fundamental split, and I think it happened originally during Clinton care when you had the Republicans who lined up against it, but it happened to a larger and more dramatic extent in 2008 and 2009 when Republicans came out, and basically Mitch McConnell came out to the Senate floor and said that his number one goal for the Senate for the year was to make sure that President Obama was a one-term president.
He didn't say on the Senate floor, though.
Oh, excuse me. But he did say that. And therefore, there was an enormous amount of pressure on Republicans, even Republicans who had been working for some of these things for years, to then back down. Olympia Snowe, rather famously moderate from Maine, voted for the bill at the Finance Committee and then was ultimately convinced not to vote for the bill on the floor. There was one House vote, one House Republican on the floor whose name I now can't remember. He was from Louisiana and he was subsequently defeated. It was an amazing array of party loyalty that was not necessarily in pursuit of good policy. And I think you're absolutely right. We're now seeing exactly the converse, an amazing array of party loyalty. We'll see whether the Republicans will be as successful as the Democrats were in keeping everybody in line. So far, they're being pretty fractious. I think people don't remember the Democrats were pretty fractious in 2009 and 2010 also. But for a couple of senators, there would be a public option in the law, which didn't happen. There were some things that were left out at the last minute. So this idea of they needed to please the conservatives in the Senate, in the House, and also, in this case, the conservative Democrats in the Senate. Now you've got sort of the moderates in the Senate and the moderates in the House on the Republican side. But I think one big difference between now and 2009, as I mentioned, 2009 you had almost the entire healthcare industry in a remarkable show of solidarity in support of doing something. It had become so bad that they basically all sued for peace. So you had the pharmaceutical industry and the hospital industry and the insurance industry and basically employers and labor all almost on the same page. You don't have that this time. So now the question is, can Republicans do this without the support of the health industry? And that's going to be one of the key tests. Thank you.
So Abbe, as we were talking about earlier, Constitution, and you said this, Constitution says nothing about health care. So why does it end up being so important? Why does it end up being something that people have expended so many resources on, in terms of legislation, but also elections, programs like this,
Yeah, it's really interesting. For something to be such an important, divisive question in our American culture, but not having to be part of the Constitution, you sort of wonder how it got here, how healthcare became so important. And it's constitutional in the sense that it goes to the question of what a government's role should be, right? What a government should do for its people. That's not in our Constitution, but it's the fundamental question about the role of government, right? It's also a question about which government should be doing things, if any government, right? State governments versus federal governments. And there's always this lingering question in health law about health policy, about whether we want states to do things or we want the federal government to do things. I think there's also this question about equality, right? So our Constitution, obviously enshrines a principle of equality for all Americans, but it doesn't say that means the government has to give everybody the exact same opportunities. But from that principle of equality, there is this sense in this country, some sense of an ethos that we're not going to let people die because they can't afford to get basic health care, right? So it's this tension. Now, there's this other tension, of course, and that's capitalism, right? So healthcare, as many of you may recall, there was Ronald Reagan was a very effective opponent of Medicare when it was first being proposed by calling it socialized medicine, right? So we turned the sort of healthcare debate into a question of American patriotism and sort of a capitalism versus socialism debate. So that gets brought into it too. And this goes back to something that Julie and Josh were saying, so I wanted to pick up on it. The way we tend to run our health care programs, the way we tend to subsidize American health care is in sort of back channel ways, right? We're doing it through the insurance industry, right? We're asking the insurance industry to accept everybody and charge everybody equal rates. And in return, we have to do something for them, right? We have to give the insurance industry more customers. So we give them a mandate. Or we do what the Republicans are doing, which is finding other ways to put the consumers into the market. But that's because we don't want to admit as a society that the government is actually doing something, and because that also contradicts sort of the American capitalist ethos, right? So, and with respect to, we could have, one of the reasons that, this is what I was going to say, my train of thought with Julie, which was that there were Republicans early on in the drafting of Obamacare. They did have a bipartisan coalition, and the reason Obamacare looks the way it did was because they were trying to be bipartisan. They were trying to get those Republican votes. If they knew they were going to have a Republican vote, they could have done something much more radical. If they're going to ram something through, they could ram through single payer. Obama wasn't going to do that, but they could have rammed through something that was much cleaner, right? And it might have been a totally different ballgame. So part of the reason the Obamacare has some of this messiness is they were trying to use a Republican platform because they were trying to get bipartisan votes. So it's a really complicated question. And they are, Obama could have taxed everybody, right? There's a big difference. Just said, what's the difference? There's a big difference between the taxing power of the federal government and the commerce power of the federal government. The taxing power is much broader, right? So they could have just taxed everybody and done health care reform. We wouldn't have had the constitutional challenge. You wouldn't have had any of this stuff. Politically unpalatable, but if you weren't going to get any Republican votes, you could have gone for something like that. It wasn't going to happen, but it's important to understand how the politics figured into the product, and also how sort of our national insecurity with saying that the government should do things for us leads us to have the government do things for us in less obvious ways, but the government is still doing those things nonetheless.
Thank you. So Josh, I've got a two-part question for you. The first, of course, is going to pick up, of course, on what Abbe was just talking about on partisanship. And so the first part of my question is whether it's fair to say that the Democrats were uniquely partisan when it came to health care, because it turns out Republicans were unified in opposing it. It wasn't at itself a partisan position. But the other part of my question is there anything Republicans would have supported?
So I think this election has taught us a remarkable lesson about polarization. I think it's safe to say that in this room, if there are more than 10 people who vote for Trump, I'd be surprised. This is where we live. We live in the city of Philadelphia, where Trump got a very small percentage of the vote. People don't agree on fundamental questions. I'll give you a good example. Every year since the 1960s, people have been polled on a question: do you support interracial marriage, right? And thankfully, that number has been going sky high. I think it's now at 80 or 90%. But another question asked is, would you be okay with your son or daughter marrying someone of the opposite political party? How do you think that question's going? So as a society, we have a severe degree of polarization. So if you have a bunch of healthcare analysts in a room, maybe they can come together with an awesome solution that would yield great results. But eventually you have to sell something to the American people. And I think the fundamental mistake that was made by the Democrats in 2009 and 2010 was that if we just pass this thing now, we have 60 votes now, everything will fall into place later. right? We have our mandates, we have our formulas, we have Jonathan Gruber, the smartest man in the world, right? Zeke Emanuel, a few blocks down. These are geniuses. They'll put this thing into place. But then politics happened. What happened? Scott Brown. So let's talk about that Scott Brown for a moment. Senator Ted Kennedy was the 60th Democrat vote. He passed away. He was replaced in an election by Scott Brown. So what did the Democrats do? They passed an incomplete version of the bill. It was a draft. It was never meant to be final. And people like Zeke Emanuel and Jonathan Gruber said, just pass this bill. We'll deal with it later. We'll deal with it later. And there were lots of things in the law that weren't quite settled. There was an entire Supreme Court case that arose, probably because Abbe would say the bill hadn't been drafted and edited enough, right? No matter. Here we are today with this law. The popularity is maybe now peaking above 50%. I don't see this as a national mandate. There are lots of ways that society can spend billions and billions of dollars to promote our welfare, education, highways, infrastructure. There's nothing set that we need to do through healthcare. That's not the only way we as a society can improve. We don't have the ethos that other European countries have, that you have a God-given right to healthcare, thankfully. I don't think that's our constitutional charter right across the street in Independence Hall, right? We have our charter of government. It's a negative charter of liberties, as Abbe quite cogently noted. So partisanship exists. I don't think we can fix it, frankly. This election, I think, illustrated perhaps partisanship doesn't fall quite the ways you want. I'm not optimistic about this repeal effort only because the sorts of things they're proposing are, again, pretty damn similar to Obamacare. But more so, even if they enact something, the other half of the country will now hate it for the exact reason that it's called Trump care and not Obamacare. So I don't know exactly what yields from this, but I think the partisanship is quite solid on both sides.
Well, I've got a lot of questions from the audience, and I'm not a fast enough reader to have gotten through all the written questions yet. But Julie, I'm going to start with one of them, and I'm going to amend it a little bit, if it's okay. The question is particularly why the House of Representatives has sort of locked under key their proposed legislation, but I understand we're getting some sense of what's emerging. Can you share with us what you think might be happening and what we know so far?
Well, part of the reason it was hidden is, legislation does tend to be written by just a couple of people. I mean, it is not, the committee process is after you get a bill to take to the committee. They do something called a markup. They mark up the draft. And I think things had leaked out, and there was so much tension that they were trying to keep this under wraps as long as they could. They have now scheduled the first committee action for Wednesday, so at 6 o'clock tonight, they released a version of one of the committee's bills. Interestingly, there are 4 committees under the budget resolution that was passed in January, 4 committees that are supposed to be making recommendations. They all have slightly different pieces of this. And we're really only seeing the House committees going to work. I've been sort of tweeting all day, is the Senate not going to do anything? Is the Senate going to wait for to see if the House can pass something? We're just not seeing any legislative action on the Senate side the way we are on the House side. I have not had a chance to look at the bill. It literally just dropped. I mean, I've glanced at it. I've seen some of the summaries. It mostly is most of the things that have been leaking out. A significant rollback, a freeze and then a rollback of Medicaid, an elimination of all of the taxes that paid for Obamacare, and for and a repeal of the mandates. These are things they can all do as part of a budget. There will be some chunk of money for the states. It's not clear what they could use that for, but perhaps for these high-risk pools that people have been talking about, so people with pre-existing conditions could continue to get insurance. And one significant thing that dropped out of the bill apparently is they were going to try to pay for some of their tax credits. They have different kinds of tax credits. They keep talking about, we're going to have refundable, advanceable tax credits. Like, well, that's actually what the Affordable Care Act has too. They're just going to have different ones, and theirs are going to be based on age rather than on income, because insurance does get more expensive as you get older. So there's actual some theory to that, but they're smaller because the Affordable Care Act tax credits are pegged to the cost of insurance. These are flat credits. So if you happen to live in a place like Philadelphia where healthcare is more expensive, it's not going to go as far for you here as it would in, perhaps Minneapolis, where healthcare is a little bit less expensive. But they were going to pay for that by capping how much of, we talked a little bit about the tax advantages for employers who offer insurance. They were going to cap that. That was going to violate what we were talking about before, about if you like it, you can keep it. That would have made a really big, significant impact on the employer insurance market, where 165 million people get their insurance. And it's a big chunk of money, so they could have paid for their tax credits. They've taken it out. I don't know how they're going to pay for it now. It may be in there, I just haven't read it yet.
That may explain in part why it's still locked under, it's locked away. I have particular questions directed at at both Abbe and Josh. So I'm going to just read Abbe, question directed for you. So Abbe indicated that the new plan would be similar to the ACA. I keep hearing about access to care, catastrophic coverage for pre-existing conditions, and block grants for Medicaid. How is that similar?
How's that similar?
Yeah.
I would say the question again.
Well, I'm gathering that what this person's heard may be coming out may not be the same as the ACA.
Oh, yeah. Wow. So we're about block grants and?
Catastrophic coverage for pre-existing conditions.
Yeah. So it's the same basic philosophy, but it's cheaper and stingier, right? So this is my point I was getting at, that we're not actually fighting over the American structure of healthcare, right? We're not fighting over big constitutional level questions about should a government be involved in giving some money to fund poor people's health insurance. Both sides are saying yes. Block grants are a cheaper way to do it than a Medicaid expansion. The Affordable Care Act Medicaid expansion moved with the different states' population. It moved with the number of individuals who are less than 138% of the poverty level, okay? So if New York or Philadelphia had X number of people at that level, they got Medicaid. If the next year there was an economic downturn and there were more poor people in Philadelphia, there'd be more with Medicaid. Block grants have the potential to being capped at a particular number or capped at a particular population, so they're unlikely to move with the economy over time. But it's still philosophically the same thing about a government's obligation in providing health care. Catastrophic coverage is also the idea that we're going to say everybody needs to have some kind of coverage. The government is telling Americans we want you to be insured, or they're making it easier for you to be insured, but they're saying that a cheap, light insurance plan is good enough for you, right? As opposed to saying we want to have some minimal level of quality with insurance. But again, it's not a matter of law or structure. It's a matter of dollars and generosity. And the other thing, just going back to Julie's point, just to hammer home what she said, those taxes are regressive, right? That means that a tax that's pegged, that isn't based on your income, hits poor people much harder than it hits rich people, right? That, again, is a philosophy about where our generosity is going to go, what segment of the population is going to get our generosity, but it's not a question about what the government's role in a healthcare system should be.
I think there's one more important point about Medicaid, and this is part of the answer to my own question, how are they going to pay for it? They're not just rolling back the expansion that the Affordable Care Act made, and I think they're actually not block granting it, they're doing this per capita cap. So if more people become poor, they will still be eligible, but the per capita cap would go up, would inflate slower than medical costs inflate, which is very much done on purpose, so Medicaid will cost less. Basically, right now, Medicaid is a shared expense between states and the federal government, and it varies by state. There's complicated formulas, but what it says is that we will pay for low-income sick people, essentially, and the federal government and the states will share that. Now what the federal government is saying, we're going to give states a set amount of money, and they can decide whether to cut benefits, cut enrollees, or cut what providers are paid, because those are basically the only three ways you can save money under Medicaid. So that's an important change that this proposal would make. So it's not just rolling back the expansion.
And there's one more factual point, which is that I meant to add, is that Josh was saying, this is not a good thing for us to be spending our money on, right? This is not sort of where we should be putting our priorities. I just want to point out one fact, that the employer tax benefit through which we all get our insurance through our office costs $200 billion a year and has been in effect since World War II. Okay, so this isn't a new thing. It's a matter of we're spending money. We've been spending money. It's what we're spending money on and who's getting the benefit of the money. But maybe we've been doing it wrong since World War II. But
I disagree with that exemption. That exemption was an awful mistake.
Actually, almost every economist, liberal and conservative, disagrees with that exemption. The problem is taking it away is taking something away. So that's one of the places where the politics are odd, because you've got Republican and Democratic economists all agree it's a dumb way to spend money.
Josh, let me tee this up as a constitutional question, but you can obviously address what's been said.
Finally, the Constitution. We're 45 minutes, haven't mentioned the Constitution yet. Where are we?
We're here.
Constitution Center.
And so, Abbe had mentioned something about whether there are any big constitutional questions left to be debated, discussed. Do you think there are some big constitutional questions left to be debated in the area of healthcare?
I actually do.
Okay. And so tell us.
So let's go back to the case of NFIB versus Sibelius. This was a decision concerning the constitutionality of the mandate and the rest of the law. Most people focus on broccoli, right? Can Congress make you buy broccoli? But there was a lingering question that was sleeping, so to speak. Congress gave a choice to the states. They said, okay, states, we will ask you to expand Medicaid. And if you decline to cover more poor people under this policy, we will take away from you a lot of money. How much money? Every penny you receive. There's this one letter sent from the HHS department to Arizona, which said, if you do not go along with this new Medicaid program, we will take away $20 billion from your budget each year. That was, I think, nearly a quarter of the state's budget. By a vote of 7-2, not 5-4, not 6-3, by a vote of 7-2, the Supreme Court said that was unconstitutional. That was coercive. Why was it coercive? Because you're basically putting a gun to someone's head and saying your money or your life. That violates the Constitution because it's forcing states into a situation. I think that if Medicaid gets block granted, there's a federalism problem there. States entered this agreement with the presumption that they'd be funding at a certain level. If that money is now being taken away at a radical rate, I think states can say it's actually putting them in a tough spot. My nightmare, and I do this every June, is how will John Roberts ruin my June? He does it every year one way or the other. He will ruin my June this way by striking on the block grant, saying it's unconstitutionally coercive to force the states into this manner. This will feed into the sanctuary cities debate. I'm changing the topic. Into the sanctuary cities debate about whether you can withdraw money from them. It's all going to come together, ruin my June next year, and I'll be back here complaining about it maybe with Jeff next time.
Well, what constitutional solution do you think would work?
In terms of healthcare?
Yeah.
I'll be frank, I'm largely agnostic on the question. People don't believe me. I am not a healthcare policy analyst. I'm a mere constitutional scholar who likes to write about things that are interesting. My one solution, right, my one suggestion is that whatever you do something that'll get 75 votes in the Senate, right? Get, not everyone, but mostly everyone to go along. And that way, when something breaks next year, you'll have people willing to actually engage in legislation. I think it's a very bad decision to do anything on these party line basis, whether it's 50, 60, it doesn't matter. Politicians are always in flux. If Al Franken's election in Minnesota went the other way, we wouldn't have Obamacare, right? This should not be something that flips on one single vote. It's far too damn important to make it fall on that matter.
So Julie, back to the question of what works. And particularly in terms of, are there specific proposals you think that are on the table now that might be feasible? That are being considered, or if not now, soon?
There's the story that I'm working on that's slugged. There's nothing new here. There really haven't been any new ideas in healthcare pretty much since the individual mandate in the late 1980s.
Well, we saw how that went, right?
Yeah, if there was a fancy new idea, somebody would have come up with it. You can basically base your health system off what other countries do. Other countries either have some sort of single payer, like Medicare, where the government funds it, but the delivery is private, or an actual socialized medicine, like the British Health Service and the VA, where the hospitals and the doctors are also funded by the government. Or I went to Switzerland in 2008 because they had decided to have an individual mandate where people had to buy insurance.
It's a strong mandate too. It's very
stiff. It is a strong mandate. Although what a lot of people don't realize about Switzerland is they have a highly regulated provider side, much more highly regulated than the U.S. has. I'm not sure that the healthcare industry would stand for the level of regulation that Switzerland has. Those are pretty much the only other things out there. So it's hard to know what could get 75 votes at this point. There are ways that you could tinker. The idea behind the Affordable Care Act was to change only as much as really needed to be changed and try not to change other things. By and large, people with employer insurance didn't get affected very much by the Affordable Care Act, except to get some more benefits, like having your kids stay on your policy. Rates have gone up much slower for employer insurance than they were going up prior to the ACA. There's a lot of debate about why that's true, but there's some thought that at least some of it is the synergy of some of the changes they made to Medicare payments and some of the actual ways they were trying to steer that boat of healthcare delivery system changes that are ongoing, and that is something that's bipartisan. But all these talks about we're just going to cut the cost of healthcare. Well, I haven't seen a way to actually do that other than have people not get it.
Well, that may lead to the question I was going to ask Abbe, which is under a couple of different questions from the audience really sort of have this as the theme, so I'll just ask it the way the audience has asked it. With the mandate removed, how would the funds for the ACA be generated? What mechanism would be provided to to control rapid premium increases in a replacement for the ACA?
Yeah, so the main idea that's been batted about, and I guess it's not in the bills tonight because we haven't seen anything, is this idea of a continuous coverage requirement. So basically, it's important to understand that what the Affordable Care Act did is that in asking insurers to insure everybody at essentially equal rates and not discriminate against the sick, it asked the insurance industry to abandon its business model, right? Okay, the insurance industry makes money by discriminating, by betting on who's a good risk, right? And this is my point about how we're sort of running everything through the insurance industry. So instead, what the Affordable Care Act does is it says, you guys are going to do this for us. You're going to almost be like a Medicare for all. You're going to let everybody in. But since you're abandoning your business model to do this, we have to give you something. I mean, the deal they made was they gave them more customers, right? That was the individual mandate. Because the individual mandate is political anathema, as Josh has made clear, they have to find a different way to do it now so it can be a political victory. And the way they're doing it now is that they're talking about having rather draconian requirements if you don't keep yourselves insured all the time. So they're going to tell people you have to be insured every day of the year, with maybe a couple weeks gap, whatever the amount is going to be, but a very small amount of time. And if you drop your insurance for any period, you're out of that. Come on in at equal rates. Then insurers can price discriminate against you, and you're not going to be able to afford insurance, right? So there's a lot of concern that that's less. So in my view, it's not that different from a mandate. Some people say, well, the government's not forcing you to do anything, so it's better as a matter of sort of constitutional ethos. It's a very strong incentive, right? And there's a big concern that certain people who have lower income or are not as educated are not going to understand the implications of this continuous coverage requirement, or are going to feel that this year I'm really strapped, so I've got to drop the insurance and I've got to hope that I'm going to be healthy later. And so people are very worried about that population. Can I make one other small comment about the 75? I think Josh's idea is great. Like, it would be wonderful to have 75 votes in support of any kind of package. I do think that someone has to raise the question about, asking the Democrats to do that after Merrick Garland didn't come to a vote, after none of the Republicans are willing to vote for Obamacare. That would be very big of the Democrats to do, and they might well do it in the interest of health care. But we're talking about the political reality. You also have to keep in mind, why should, I would like to know, why should the Democrats join on to a Republican bill? Merrick Garland did not even go to the floor of the U.S. Senate. And so there's been a lot of very rough politics by the Republicans for the last several years. And, it seems unfair to have to ask the Democrats to bend this way. It would be good for the country, and they might do it because they care about health care. But I do think it's something that deserves to be said. It's very unfair. We're coming into the Supreme Court hearings in the next couple of weeks, and it's a question that's looming over everybody's heads about why the Republicans get to do something that they didn't let the other side do. And that's not the way to shape any kind of policy in this country.
Josh, I want to let you answer that, and then I have one question for you from the audience.
Sure.
First, in answer to Abby's question.
Politics is politics is politics. And he said, she said, you did, right? If we start taking the position, and I think it's a reasonable position, well, they didn't vote for Garland, I won't vote for this, and they didn't vote for this, I won't vote for this. And at that point, Congress can't do anything at all. I've written several papers. I had a paper in the Harvard Law Review this past summer called Gridlock, which discusses how, when Congress doesn't get along, it allows the president to seize the power. And when the Republicans and Democrats were butting their heads over the last 8 years, you had Barack Obama, a guy probably most of the people in the room voted for twice, was able to use executive power in a very effective manner. Guess what, guys? If the Republicans and Democrats can't get along now, guess who's in charge? The guy you didn't vote for, right? Trump. So I think Congress, right? It's political, right? But if they want to assert their Article I powers, that is the article of the Constitution over legislation, they should find a way to agree. And if they don't, then the president will simply use executive action to stabilize the law. The same way that President Obama suspended the individual mandate, he suspended the employer mandate, he suspended various taxes, He spent money that was never appropriated, took lots of illegal actions to keep the ACA afloat. If Congress does not get around to it, I think then that the president can do a lot on his own, which I don't think I'll like, and I don't think you'd like either. And your question?
Well, it's a long question from an audience member,
Long
but
question.
But I'm inclined to ask it just because it's so detailed.
Let's go. Let's go.
But it's for you, and it's about FISA.
FISA. Ooh,
So
sexy. Good.
Okay. It says, what is a Title III agency?
Oy vey.
And what other entities besides the President, NSA, and FBI have authority to initiate FISA? And the second part is, are all FISA requests made solely by the Justice Department?
Oh, what a good question. So I think the province of the question has to do with Mr. Trump's morning tweets the other day. So I think this was Saturday morning. President Trump tweeted around 6:30 a.m. This is, I guess, when he gets up. That President Obama bugged him, right? That President Obama wiretapped Trump Tower. The evidence of this is a couple reports in places like Breitbart and Mark Levin and otherwise. Okay, so here's actually the way that this operates. Generally speaking, under the Fourth Amendment, drafted not too far from here, if the government wants to search you, which includes tapping your phones, they need to get a search warrant. And they can apply for a search warrant from a regular Article III judge, a regular life-confirmed judge, sits right across the street at the federal courthouse here in Philadelphia. If they decline it, too bad. But then there's something even stronger. If the government wants to search a foreign person, a foreign agent, they can get a warrant from what's called the FISA court. FISA stands for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And they can basically go to a judge. It's secret. These proceedings are not made public. We have suspicion that this foreign agent is doing something bad. Okay? And the FISA judge can give a warrant. You maybe are familiar with this because of Edward Snowden, who revealed a lot of the FISA decisions. But the crux of this is when you record the phone calls of a foreign agent, what happens if that foreign agent calls a U.S. citizen? Oh. So it often happens that even though the United States government can't wiretap a U.S. citizen through FISA, if we are listening to foreign conversations and they dial up Trump Tower, for example, that conversation will make it to the rolls. So procedurally, the president, that is President Obama, can't himself request a FISA warrant. That goes to the Justice Department. Although, as you all know, the Justice Department, the Attorney General, works for the president. So the fact that Obama bugged me or the Obama administration bugged me, it wouldn't matter one way or the other. But what's important about this tweet, and if this tweet was significant, it is that he acknowledged the existence, perhaps, of a FISA warrant. And when the president acknowledges the existence of a FISA warrant, guess what? That declassifies it. So now, it's true. So now, if indeed this happened, he acknowledged the existence of it, it's declassified, it can be released. Now, this is where the Democrats are frothing at the mouth. Why were they putting a wiretap on foreign agents calling into Trump Tower? Is there some there, right? Now, this is, we can talk about the impeachment in the next one, right? I know people getting excited in this room. But the fact, it's true.
I'm measuring the temperature, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, well, the fact of the matter is, the president can't initiate this directly. Now, the next step is Congress will issue an investigation into this. In fact, Senator Grassley, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, has already started an investigation. And perhaps we'll get some insights into what was the basis of this tweet. Or more likely, as my life has been the last month, we blow up, we get angry over something, and the next day we do something else. And we have an immigration travel ban, we have Obamacare, we have this, we have that. Our lives are just bouncing from one thing to the next. We are merely checkers on a piece being moved around as we attempt to get rich or die trying, so to speak.
Well, it's good to get to metaphysics.
Or 50 Cent.
And so I want to, the fact that Josh is talking about all these other areas does bring us to sort of a final consideration I want to run by each of you, starting with you, Julie. Carl Llewellyn, of course, famously described law as like a bramble bush. I think of it sometimes more like a spider web. You touch it in one place, it reverberates somewhere else. And so healthcare is a little bit like that as well.
Both, I would say.
Of course. It's connected to all sorts of things. And everybody here has made reference to the fact that in just a couple of weeks, we have a Supreme Court confirmation hearing beginning for President Trump's nominee, Neil Gorsuch. Is healthcare on a collision course with that Supreme Court appointee? Do we think that this is an area that will end up back in the courts? to what extent do we think the future of the ACA really depends on the courts?
I'm not sure the extent to which it depends on the courts. I think Josh is absolutely right, though. The extent to which Congress gets gridlocked gives all the power to the administration, and that's something to think about. The extent to which this current effort gets wrapped up with the Gorsuch nomination is simply time on the calendar. Time is ticking away for healthcare right now. There's a couple of deadlines. One of them is that until they finish healthcare, they can't start on the budget and tax reform that they want to do because of the way the budget process works. When you have a set of reconciliation instructions, it goes away as soon as you do a new budget resolution. So they have to finish healthcare before they can do the next budget, and they have to do the next budget before they can do tax reform. The other timeline that's ticking is that plans have to say whether they're going to offer coverage in the individual market next year. The administration just delayed that until June. It was supposed to be the first week of May. Now it's the third week of June. But there's only so long that the insurance industry and the individual market can wait before it knows whether that's going to be a viable market for next year. And there's an extent to which doing nothing would tell insurers that they might as well just not offer coverage. They have no idea what's going to happen. So those are the two pieces that they need to get ironed out. The Supreme Court debate obviously will consume a lot of time in the Senate no matter what happens, and that's what they're butting up against. So I don't know whether it's going to be whatever happens to the court. It's simply the existence of something that takes so much of the oxygen for the Senate while they're trying to do this in time to let the insurance industry know what's going to happen next year.
So Abbe, final thoughts on sort of the future of the ACA, how you perceive where it may take us, back to the courts or back to politics?
I agree with Julie. I don't think that the Affordable Care Act is really heading to the courts. I mean, I think that we had our constitutional challenge. The second challenge in the Supreme Court was a very petty statutory challenge and wasn't really about anything about the law. I don't think that we're going to see that. There are healthcare issues that are going to go to the court, like transgender rights, right? The court just today sent the transgender case they could have heard this year back to the lower courts, and presumably when they have a full complement, that case may come back up. But there are reproductive rights. There are all sorts of healthcare issues that may go to the court. But I don't think the Affordable Care Act. Now, it's entirely possible the Republicans could put something in a replacement bill that merits a constitutional challenge in the same way the Affordable Care Act did. Josh already alluded to one idea, and there could be many more. And so, I think it's possible that we might see it, but I don't see it going that way. I think the issue really is the clock. I think Julie's exactly right. It's a big clock. It's not just that. There's also the 2018 clock. The midterm elections are coming up, right? And so many people think if they don't do something by the Senate also goes in recess, right? If you don't do something by Memorial Day, a lot of people think that the Senate's not going to want to touch anything because then you start turning to 2018, right? Then you have a year, and then we're returning 2020, right? And you may remember that originally, back as soon as Trump was elected, they said they were going to repeal and what? Repeal and delay. Right? They were going to repeal with no effect, delay the impact of the repeal of the Affordable Care Act until 2019, 2010, 2020. They basically were going to bypass the whole presidency and deal with the implementation later because they didn't want to have the political fallout. I think that's where we are. I think they do want to pass something. I'm more optimistic than Josh that something's going to pass. I think they want to pass something. I just don't know what it's going to be.
And speaking of the clock.
Yeah, speaking of the clock, but I will give you dispensation to have some final thoughts, particularly as it may relate to the Constitution, of course, and the future of the ACA.
Well, I think invariably what we've seen is that when people lose elections, they go to the courts, right? When Republicans lost in 2008, they challenged Obamacare in the courts. When Democrats lost in the last election, within minutes they went to the court to challenge the immigration action. So I don't care what the issue is. People wind up in the courts. It gives me something to write about. It gives Abbe something to write about. It gives Julie something to write about. I think the reason why is the court is the counter-majoritarian conduit. Democrats won't be able to stop this reconciliation bill. The only thing that will stop this reconciliation bill will be people like Rand Paul and the Freedom Caucus and other Republicans. But Nancy Pelosi can't do a damn thing to stop it. And because she can't do anything to stop it, the second President Trump's, you see his signature's like this, right? The second that signature dries, the Washington Attorney General, the California Attorney General will conjure up some constitutional argument. They'll find one about federalism or something, dignity, I don't know, whatever comes to constitutional law nowadays, and they'll find a way to challenge it. And invariably, people will come around to it. So I don't think this is going anywhere. If you know anything about the Constitution, it's more or less permeated every major national debate our republic has had in nearly 250 years. I don't think this will be an exception.
So we will be back talking about this fairly soon, is my guess. Josh, in the meantime, will be downstairs signing his book.
Buy a book.
And if
a
you
good
don't
book.
come and talk to him and let him sign a book, he'll write a new one in that time you give him.
I have a couple hours. I can pull it off.
We've been very lucky today. We've had 3 fabulous panelists talking about a very complex subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Yes, sir.